In the grand tradition of Hollywood excess and creative overreach, the 1990s carved out a particularly infamous and enduring niche for themselves: the decade of terrible sequels, prequels, and remakes. It wasn't merely that the studios had run dry on new ideas, though that was certainly part of it. It was that they had developed a strange and aggressive confidence in the idea that previous hits could be recycled, repackaged, and resold with minimal effort and maximum spectacle. The assumption was simple and cynical. If it worked once, it would probably work again, especially if it was louder, dumber, and came wrapped in a bigger marketing budget. The result was a cinematic graveyard littered with the remains of once promising franchises and cult classics that had been dragged back onto the screen long after their expiration dates. These films weren't just bad. They were often tone-deaf, soulless attempts to bottle lightning twice with wet matches and broken glass. They tried to coast on nostalgia and brand recognition, but more often than not, they crashed hard into audience indifference, or worse, outright ridicule. This isn't to say the other decades didn't have their slew of bad sequels or remakes. The 1970s, for instance, gave us 3 sequels to Airport, turning the classic airport procedural into an increasingly bizarre series of airborne nightmares, while Exorcist II, The Heretic, Jaws 2, and Beyond the Poseidon Adventure took some of the most harrowing films of the decade and turned them into boring schlock. For remakes, there was the likes of 1978's The Big Sleep, a remake of the 1946 Humphrey Bogart classic that was basically softcore porn and had all the subtlety of a train crash. Sloppy, sleazy, and just unpleasant to sit through. The 1980s was pretty good for sequels. It gave us The Empire Strikes Back, The Wrath of Khan, Back to the Future 2, Aliens, and Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. However, for every good sequel, there had to be at least one bad. The 1980s continued to beat the dead horse, or shark, that was Jaws, with 2 further unnecessary sequels to the unnecessary sequel. Crocodile Dundee 2 asked the pointless question of what happened after Happily Ever After. Staying Alive was a hopeless mess that basically missed all the soul and charm of 1977's Saturday Night Fever, the rough-and-tumble, blue-collar classic disco movie with not a single bell-bottom in sight. And as for the 2000s, Son of the Mask. I think that speaks for itself. Anyway, while the 1990s weren't unique for bad sequels, prequels, or remakes, there was something very special about how bad some of these films got, mostly because of what specifically they were trying to expand or reimagine. Things kicked off early, and the signs of decline were obvious from the start. In 1990, The Godfather Part III hit theaters with a weight of expectation that few films could bear. On paper, the project looked airtight. Francis Ford Coppola returned to the director's chair, Al Pacino reprised his role as Michael Corleone, and the production promised to deliver a final chapter to one of the most respected and revered sagas in cinema history. But what audiences got was a film that lacked the tight focus, emotional power, and operatic grandeur of its predecessors. Instead of family, loyalty, and power, the story dove into convoluted Vatican banking scandals, leaving many viewers scratching their heads. Things were made worse by last-minute casting chaos. Winona Ryder, originally cast as Mary Corleone, dropped out days before filming began, and Coppola made the fateful decision to cast his daughter Sophia in the role. Sophia, God bless her, was trying her best, but her performance was clearly the work of someone not ready for that kind of spotlight and was panned by critics and fans alike. Throw in an incest subplot that went absolutely nowhere, and a meeting of mobsters that is broken up by a helicopter coming in and machine gunning them while some loopy guy screams about his lucky coat before being riddled with bullets, and you've got a movie that severely misses the mark when it came to building on the subtle tension, quiet restraint, and deep psychological grit of the original 2 movies. The tragedy depicted on screen wasn't just Michael's slow, lonely descent into irrelevance. It mirrored the film itself, which limped to the finish line without the fire or finesse that had made the first 2 installments timeless classics. It's not the worst sequel ever made. There are some good things about it. But because of the fact that it was yoked onto the legendary Godfather series, turned what would otherwise be a middling mob movie into the runt of the litter. The trilogy didn't end with a bang, but with a confused, drawn-out whimper that left many wondering if it would have been better to leave well enough alone. Just 1 year later, in 1991, Hollywood offered another cautionary tale, disguised as a sequel with Highlander II, The Quickening. If The Godfather Part III was disappointing, Highlander II was downright insulting. The original Highlander had been a messy but charming cult hit, built around the compelling mythology of immortal warriors locked in a centuries-long battle, all leading to the famous final line, "There can be only one." That tagline alone had etched itself into pop culture, a declaration of singularity and finality that gave the original film a sense of closure and epic purpose. But apparently, someone in a studio boardroom took that line and twisted it into a justification for more content, not better. The sequel tossed out the original film's mythology with reckless abandon and replaced it with one of the most baffling plot retcons in film history. The immortals weren't ancient humans with a mysterious curse. They were aliens from the planet Zeist. The change didn't just bend the rules of the universe, it shattered them. Fans were stunned, critics were brutal. Even director Russell Mulcahy was so embarrassed by the theatrical cut that he eventually assembled a new version, dubbed the Renegade Cut, to try and salvage what was left. But even taking away the whole Zeist thing, the film is just a total mess from start to finish. This is the kind of movie that gives you the impression it was written in a coffee break, or the reins of the project were handed to a small child with a vivid imagination, but not a single coherent thought. The plot holes are so big, you can practically drive a pickup truck through them. The production quality is woefully bad. Character motivations and pretty much every single thing you see on screen happens for no established reason, and you're left asking 10 million questions to which you'll never get an answer, and you know it. But honestly, after the opening shot of space aliens and laser fights, you're probably laughing or crying so hard that you're beyond caring. Highlander 2 became a textbook example of how not to make a sequel, and it remains one of the most notoriously bad follow-ups of all time. By the time the mid-1990s rolled around, Hollywood had clearly entered a phase of creative stagnation when it came to sequels and remakes. Things weren't just stale, they were actively getting worse. Studios were throwing bigger budgets at thinner ideas, hoping that name recognition would be enough to carry a film to box office success. One of the most notorious examples of this misguided optimism was Speed 2: Cruise Control, which limped into theaters in 1997. Where the original Speed had been a tight, relentless action film, driven by the ticking clock premise of a bus that couldn't drop below 50 miles per hour, the sequel decided to slow everything down, literally. It relocated the action to a cruise ship, robbing the franchise of its urgency and replacing it with sluggish plotting and maritime monotony. Keanu Reeves, who clearly sensed the creative nosedive, declined to return, leaving Sandra Bullock to anchor the film alone. She was joined by Willem Dafoe, whose villain spent much of the runtime dripping with sweat, battling a blood condition with leeches, and delivering vague monologues about corporate betrayal. His plan, something about computer chips and vengeance, never really made sense, and the entire film came off like a bloated, overproduced parody of its predecessor. Setting production in the Caribbean was also another bold but misguided move. Jaws and Waterworld had been harsh exercises in how difficult filming in the open sea can be, but the guys behind Speed 2 decided to ignore these lessons. With that, the budget exploded, with the final sequence of the ship crashing into a fake waterfront at Marigot on the island of St. Martin, costing more than the entire production of the original Speed movie. Audiences weren't impressed, and critics were merciless. What was meant to be a thrilling follow-up became a cautionary tale about how not to handle a sequel. The following year didn't offer much redemption. In 1998, Gus Van Sant took a swing at remaking Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho, a film that, by nearly every metric, didn't need to be touched. But Van Sant wasn't content with a reinterpretation or modern update. Instead, he went with a shot-for-shot remake, recreating Hitchcock's original down to the camera angles and pacing, but swapping in modern actors and color film. Vince Vaughn, best known at the time for playing fast-talking Chalmers, was cast as Norman Bates. And while he committed to the role, his performance never quite captured the unsettling nuance of Anthony Perkins. The experiment, which may have seemed daring on paper, ultimately felt lifeless and redundant on screen. Audiences didn't connect with it, and critics questioned the point of spending millions to essentially mimic a masterpiece without enhancing or reimagining it in any meaningful way. What could have been an interesting commentary on cinema history ended up as a hollow exercise in style without substance. Anyway, going back to the beginning of the decade, and in his fifth outing as Rocky Balboa, Sylvester Stallone gives us Rocky V of 1990, an abrupt tonal shift for one of cinema's most beloved sports franchises. In this one, a retired and brain-damaged Balboa returns to his Philadelphia roots after losing his fortune to a crooked accountant as he trains young boxer Tommy Gunn but neglects his son, Robert. And after Gunn betrays him, Rocky wins a final street fight to reclaim his legacy. If you want tonal whiplash, I give you Rocky V. From the insane excess and spectacle of Rocky IV, including steroid-induced Soviet boxers and even robots for Pete's sake, director John G. Avildsen, who had helmed the original Rocky, sought to bring the series back to its working-class roots, focusing on family strain, mentorship, and humiliation rather than championship glory. Rocky's attempt to rebuild his life in Philadelphia is complicated by his relationship with a young protege, Tommy Gunn, whose ambition ultimately turns him into an antagonist, and the story culminates not in a triumphant bout under the lights, but in a raw street fight, a deliberate rejection of the franchise's established formula. While on paper the premise seems grounded, realistic, and potentially heartbreaking, the outcome is something that leans far too hard into this tone that it becomes just downright depressing. In its desire to escape from the tropes of a glorious final fight in the ring and its otherwise heroic, America-centric overtones, the movie ended up escaping from its entire audience, alienating longtime fans while ironically leaning heavily into nostalgic flashbacks of the original Rocky movie. The acting is also quite hammy, especially from Tommy Morrison as Gunn, and it otherwise feels less like the movie is trying to step back from becoming a self-parody, as per Rocky IV, and more like a back turned on all the tropes that made the franchise so adored by fans. Although Rocky V earned a respectable $119 million worldwide, reception was mixed to negative. Critics and fans alike felt the film lacked the inspirational lift that had defined the series, and the downbeat ending left audiences unsatisfied. In later years, Stallone himself would acknowledge the film as a wrong turn, a necessary stumble that eventually led to a more reflective redemption in later sequels. But if Rocky V represented an 80s action star seeking to upturn the status quo to try and remain relevant, Under Siege 2, Dark Territory, released in 1995, was a 90s action star seeking to upturn the status quo while still trying to find relevance. Love him or hate him, Steven Seagal, the monotone, underplayed martial artist with a girly ponytail who had the advantage of being born without a single outward emotion, was very much the budget imitator of the one-man army lead of 1980s action blockbusters. After years as a fight coordinator and running a dojo, Seagal's breakthrough came with 1992's Under Siege, which was basically Die Hard on a battleship, but was actually a really entertaining movie, with top marks going to Tommy Lee Jones as the villain. While the film was good, Seagal was the least interesting part about it, and it showed in that while the movie raked in $156 million at the box office, audiences turned up more for the premise than they did for the actor. This was proven in 1994 with the cinematic belly flop into Prince William's sound that was on Deadly Ground. This was directed and produced by Seagal, and thus had his fingerprints all over the insane mess that resulted, hammering in environmental messages, action tropes, hammy villains, including Michael Caine putting on a stupendously bad American accent, and Seagal getting in touch with his inner Native American. This thing crashed and burned worse than the oil rig at the end of the movie, which, by the way, makes no sense too, because how is blowing up an oil rig supposed to stop an oil spill? If anything, it makes it worse because now you can't shut it off. Anyway, despite On Deadly Ground being a huge mess, some people in Hollywood still couldn't help but feel that Seagal had the potential to be the next Bruce Willis, and so they went back to his roots with a sequel to Under Siege. This time, his indestructible former U.S. Navy SEAL, Casey Ryback, is transferred from ship to train with his niece Sarah, where the arrival of evil genius Travis Dane and an international team of hijackers interrupts their relaxing journey through the majestic Rocky Mountains. With Dane in command, he pulls a Diamonds Are Forever and takes control of a dangerous military satellite with a high-power laser and threatens to lay waste to anyone who opposes him. Directed by Jeff Murphy, a filmmaker known for efficiency rather than flourish, the production emphasized practical stunts, fistfights in dining cars, and explosions timed with passing tunnels. Now, I could go on about how this film is really awful, but actually, compared to a lot of sequels on this list, it's passable. It's not nearly as entertaining as the first Under Siege, and the plot is basically a complete recycle of the original. It's Die Hard on a train, living up to every trope, even though the whole Die Hard thing was actually starting to become pretty tired by the mid-1990s. The premise is silly, the acting is pretty flat, and although Eric Bogosian's Travis Dane is actually pretty entertaining, he's not as over-the-top fun as Tommy Lee Jones was in the first movie. The CGI is pretty unconvincing, and there's a spectacular train crash at the end which looks less like an epic cataclysm and more like some kid smashing two model trains together. While I'm a proponent of less CGI and more practical effects, I think a little CGI flourish could have helped make that crash look a little more convincing. Also, my best friend Erica's dad worked for the Southern Pacific, and I remember he didn't take kindly to having a Southern Pacific train smashed up in the climax. Disgraceful! However, the biggest problem with this movie, like all his movies, is Seagal himself. You simply can't get behind him. He has no investment. You know he can win. He barely gets a scratch, despite bullets flying everywhere and getting into vicious knife fights. It's almost as if someone froze his face with one expression and it stuck, while his monotone is enough to put any insomniac to sleep. Unlike the big, muscle-bound bruisers of Stallone and Schwarzenegger, or the less bulky but equally nimble one-man armies like Willis, Seagal shows no remorse, no joy, no pain. If he's invincible, and he knows it, why should we care what happens to him? The outcome is obvious. The only reason you stick around is simply to see how Seagal gets out of it unscathed this time. And in that capacity, audiences and critics agreed. The film ultimately earned about $104 million worldwide, barely breaking even against a $60 million budget, but critics were far less enthusiastic. Reviews suggested that while the action was competently staged, the sequel felt like a mechanical exercise in repetition, as if the original film had simply been transferred to a new vehicle without much imagination, creating an unmistakable sense of déjà vu on rails. After this, Seagal's career really fell into decline, and he was relegated to a bit part in 1996's Executive Decision, before disappearing into the realm of direct-to-video purgatory. It was clear then that he was never going to be the next Bruce Willis, and after various revelations about his personal indiscretions, we're kind of glad he never did. In 1999, the downward trend continued with The Haunting, a remake of the atmospheric 1963 horror film directed by Robert Wise. The original had built its fear through subtlety, silence, and suggestion, a haunted house story that thrived on what you didn't see. But the remake, directed by Jean de Bont, took a very different approach. It traded psychological tension for flashy special effects and overwrought set design, filling Hill House with CGI ghosts, shape-shifting decor, and dramatic swirling winds. Catherine Zeta-Jones played the sultry, bohemian Theo, gliding through scenes that felt more like a perfume commercial than a ghost story, while Liam Neeson looked on with scientific curiosity and growing confusion. The film was drenched in digital effects that looked dated almost immediately, and the scares landed with the grace of a hammer to the face. It wanted to be terrifying, epic, and emotional, but instead came off as a muddled, noisy misfire that misunderstood what made the original so effective. Another remake from 1999 that fell short of the goal was Wild Wild West, starring Will Smith and Kevin Kline. Written in part by S.S. Wilson of Tremors fame, Wild Wild West was a modern reinterpretation of the classic 1960s TV show of the same name, wherein Will Smith stars as U.S. Army Captain James T. Jim West, and Kevin Kline is U.S. Marshal Artemis Gordon and U.S. President Ulysses S. Grant. From the very start, this movie misses the mark, with a questionable plot about a racist, legless ex-Confederate officer in a steam-powered wheelchair named Dr. Arliss Lovelace, who intends to dissolve the United States and divide the territory among Great Britain, France, Spain, Mexico, and the Native American people, while keeping some land for himself, using a mixture of spinning saw blades and a giant mechanical spider as the weapons of his campaign. with West and Gordon working in a tense buddy cop partnership to stop him. While there are some impressive things in the movie, with the flying saw blades and the mechanical spider being visually interesting, and Kenneth Branagh as Loveless can be kind of funny at times, pretty much every joke in this comedy fails to land like a rookie pilot on his first touchdown on the deck of an aircraft carrier during a hurricane. For instance, every joke from Loveless is that he's racist, while every joke against him is that he's got no legs, a theme which gets very old, very fast. When it's not the racist or legless jokes, the other jokes either drag on too long that they stop being funny or were never funny to begin with. The actors look like they are ready for lunch, and Will Smith, bringing more or less the same shtick as he did in Independence Day and Men in Black, really doesn't work for this movie and felt tired already. The film was a critical disaster, and audiences were equally ambivalent, coming in below its projected break-even at the box office and ruining Smith's run as a consistent financial draw after a string of successes. Of course, no summary of 1999's poorly thought expansions to a franchise would be complete without Star Wars Episode I, The Phantom Menace. This was by far the most hyped movie of the decade, a prequel to the classic Star Wars trilogy, and the first time a new Star Wars movie had been in theaters since 1983's Return of the Jedi. To get everyone all excited, the original 3 films had been remastered with the special edition releases of 1997. And while they made bank at the box office when re-released in cinemas, they also provided a terrible sign of things to come. For instance, George Lucas had indulged himself completely in new CGI technology and shoehorned into the original movies new sequences that either spoiled the flow of the movie or were complete cringe. This was an early warning that this new prequel that Lucas was proposing, which had already made back its production budget on hype alone long before it hit the big screen, might be trouble. And trouble it was. The Phantom Menace was one of the big financial hitters of the decade, but oh boy, what a confused mess. The plot revolved around the discovery of Anakin Skywalker, the future villain and series icon Darth Vader, amid a confrontation between the people of Naboo and the blockading Trade Federation, with Jedis and Dark Lords and Queens and 7-foot CGI frogs and 10-year-old boys all thrown into the mix. While it was evident in Return of the Jedi that George Lucas was leaning into the merchandise for kids with the appearance of the Ewoks, here, George has gone full kiddie mode. Everything you see on screen is there for one reason, and one reason alone. It's there to sell toys. The jokes are for kids, the action scenes are for kids, the characters are for kids. The only thing that isn't for kids is the plot line. With all this political gibberish and going back and forth being less an action-packed Star Wars movie and more a congressional subcommittee on bad tactics in the Banana Republics being shown live on MSNBC. It's like Lucas wanted to make a Star Wars plot centered around the Iran-Contra scandal. To top it all off, the acting is very wooden. I know people have a real downer on Jake Lloyd playing Anakin, but honestly, you should really give him a break. No one gives a good performance in this movie. They're all stilted and monotone, like a vacuum cleaner sucked out all of their emotion. The original Star Wars trilogy wasn't perfect by any metric when it came to acting, with the first movie being a little hammy at times when it came to performances. But at least people had emotion, and their delivery made you care. In The Phantom Menace, you couldn't give two hoots about these people. They look like dress mannequins from a local department store trussed up in Jedi robes. Also, should I mention Jar Jar Binks? No, everyone else has already, so what's the point? But, not to be a complete downer, there are some good things about this film, though. The CGI is actually not that bad for 1999, and was amazing to see on the big screen for the first time. The John Williams score was also another fantastic element, which really had weight and gravitas, and it was clear the man still had the knack when it came to giving life to a feature. Much like The Godfather Part III, this movie would be a middling sci-fi adventure film if it was its own thing. Visually spectacular, but lacking any nuance or character to make it truly superb. The problem is, it was attached to Star Wars, perhaps the biggest sci-fi franchise in world history. And when you compare it to A New Hope, The Empire Strikes Back, and even Return of the Jedi, it pales in comparison. It has no subtlety. It has some charm, but not enough to make it charming. It was obvious then, and it's obvious now, that it was just done to make money. And in that respect, it worked perfectly. Star Wars fever would dominate the 2000s, leading to a further 2 sequels in 2002 and 2005, which became increasingly overdone CGI bloodbaths. With so many zeros and ones flying across the screen, it was like someone had kicked a digital hornet's nest. It's not the worst thing ever made in the Star Wars franchise. Not even close. For instance, there was that awful Clone Wars movie from 2008, which, to quote Yahtzee Croshaw, felt like a 2-hour introductory cutscene to a video game, while pretty much everything made under Disney's tenure, aside from Rogue One, has fallen flat on its face. Need we forget the politically fueled mess that was The Last Jedi? Or the incoherent, disjointed disaster of The Rise of Skywalker? However, what The Phantom Menace is guilty of is setting the tone for Star Wars. It was all CGI all the way, and the spark that made the first 3 films genuine classics appears, unlike The Jedi, never to return. See what I did there? Now, after that big long ramble about Star Wars, let's finish things off with something more obscure. An honorary mention from just inside 2000, Blair Witch 2, Book of Shadows, a sequel that seemed determined to undo everything that made the first film such a cultural phenomenon. The Blair Witch Project, released just a year earlier in 1999, had captivated audiences with its lo-fi, found-footage realism and raw, almost primal fear. It was innovative not just in style, but in marketing, blurring the line between fiction and reality in a way that shook audiences and made it one of the most profitable indie films of all time. Rather than build on that momentum, the sequel abandoned the found footage format entirely and opted for a slick, scripted horror narrative that tried and failed to comment on the impact of the original film. It introduced new characters, muddled timelines, and a pseudo-intellectual framework about hysteria and media influence, but forgot to include anything genuinely scary. The result was a messy, disjointed film that alienated fans and confused newcomers. What could have been a clever meta-horror experience devolved into an incoherent series of gothic tropes and pretentious dialogue. Far from elevating the franchise, Book of Shadows effectively derailed it. And for that matter, what even is the Book of Shadows? It's never brought up. It doesn't appear. It's just a brainless, boring, pretentious, self-indulgent mess that is both over-the-top and underwhelming at the same time. I know it's not a 90s movie, but I wanted to throw it in because it really is too stupid for words, and is, ironically, barely a shadow when compared to the superior original. By that point, the pattern was no longer surprising. It was inevitable. Hollywood had developed an almost pathological belief that audiences would blindly support anything tied to a known property. Familiarity was the drug, and studios were addicted. It didn't matter if the sequel made sense, if the remake added value, or if the prequel enriched the original. What mattered was the name on the poster. The failures, of course, were plentiful. They came in waves. Films that didn't need sequels got them anyway, often years too late, with casts and crews who seemed visibly unsure why they were even there. Remakes stripped of their soul. Prequels that rewrote history not to deepen it, but to cash in on nostalgia with a side of exposition. And it wasn't just about the lack of original ideas. What made so many of these films painful to watch wasn't that they existed. It was how cynically they were made. These weren't labors of love. They were assignments, studio checklists disguised as screenplays. Somewhere along the line, the creative spark got snuffed out, and what was left was pure brand management. Most of these projects didn't feel like anyone involved wanted to make them. They felt like the result of someone at a boardroom table shrugging and saying, "It worked before, right?" By the time the decade came to a close, little had changed in terms of lessons learned. If anything, the failures of the 90s paved the way for the IP-obsessed churn of the 2000s and beyond. But even as the machinery got more polished and the CGI got slicker, there's still something uniquely clunky and fascinating about the 90s misfires. That era holds a special, awkward place in the cultural archives. It gave us space immortals in trench coats, action movies with zero action, haunted houses with no scares, and a Norman Bates who for some reason decided to masturbate mid-peep. First of all, subtle. Second of all, ew!
Come along, let's sing, where the joy will bring. Tune into the beat, feel the magic, it's true. Channel 199 X, we're here just for you.